My name is Jonathan White. I'm Professor of Politics at the European Institute of the London School of Economics and Political Science. Welcome to my exp. I think one might see the story of 2020 not just as the story of emergency politics, of national lockdowns, of transnational forms of exceptionism, the European Central Bank increasing its powers and so on in the spring of 2020. But one might also see this year as the story of anti-emergency politics. Think of anti-lockdown protests, which I think often have this flavour not so much of individuals asserting their right not to wear a mask. It's clearly, of course, on one level as banal as that, but I think at the same time it's an insistence on that there should be the right to choose how to respond to exceptional circumstances rather than to assume that certain types of response are mandated, that the authority of medical practitioners and so on should be contested rather than accepted. So it's anti-lockdown protests, it's anti-mask protests. I think it's also the response often far-right leaders in power, Bolsonaro, Trump, Johnson, all of whom at different moments, I think in 2020, were reluctant actually to embrace emergency rule and more inclined to insist that they would do things differently, that they would somehow diminish the threats in question. A discourse study of Boris Johnson in this period found that he was far more inclined to use words like "I want" when talking about public policy than certain more centre-left or liberal countries, such as in New Zealand, where the language of choice was "we need." And I think that's significant. I think in many countries in this period where populists were in power, there was this desire to frame choices as an extension of volition, of what we want to do, rather than what we have to do. It seems to me that the only way that one can really chart a third path would be some type of rediscovery of a politics of principle, of ideology, which then shifts the emphasis of decision-making rather to priorities, to ideological commitments, rather than simply responding to events as they arise or simply denouncing those in power for their acquiescence in the politics of the moment, the problems of the moment. It's, I think, striking that the rise of emergency rule in the 21st century corresponds to the decline of ideological forms of politics, the decline of mass political parties, forms of politics which bound leaders on the one hand to a certain set of ideas, a certain set of commitments, and also bound them to the decision-making apparatus of a political party, for example, rather than simply concentrating power in the hands of the few. Climate change, of course, is a very distinctive form of crisis, and it does indeed seem to be encouraging new forms of emergency politics, some of which are to to speak in a simple dichotomy, some of which are emergency politics from above, so existing governments governing extreme situations that are somehow associated to climate politics, floods, droughts, and so on, the rise of extreme draconian measures as ways of handling those forms of situation. I think we can expect more and more of that. But at the same time, we might see in the context of climate politics something like an emergency politics from below emerging, an emergency politics located in social movements, for example. Extinction Rebellion is in some ways exactly a kind of emergency politics in its claims for civil disobedience, in its claims that because of the exceptional gravity of the global warming threat and the need to change policy to a very urgent set of deadlines, that one can no longer simply accept political authority as it has existed, that one can't necessarily endorse the rule of law or existing electoral procedures when the stakes are as high as this. And so calls for civil disobedience are in some sense exactly a form of emergency politics from below. They are exceptional measures, if you like, for exceptional times.